But first, one of the nastiest insults I have heard yet, and not just against me, Tim Flannery. To me, Flannery is the perfect symbol of the death of reason. Flannery is actually an expert on mammals, but the Gillard Labor government made him our Chief Climate Commissioner because he was our most famous global warming alarmist, making outlandish predictions. Now, Tim Flannery is today Chief Counsellor of the Climate Council and also a professorial fellow at Melbourne University and still preaching on global warming, except he now writes on the taxpayer-funded Conversation website that he has failed. Governments aren't cutting our emissions enough, he claims, and this simple fact forces me to look back on my 20 years of climate activism as a colossal failure. I wish. In fact, I think Flannery has been appallingly effective for reasons I'll get to. But I want to focus first on that appalling insult. Flannery, on the Conversation website, likens sceptics who question alarmists just like him to child abusers, to pedophiles. That's certainly how I read him. Let me show you. Flannery first warns preposterously that man-made global warming and a loss of resources is going to wipe out most of the Earth's population of nearly 8 billion people. He says British scientist James Lovelock has predicted a future human population of just 1 billion people. Mass deaths are predicted. Let me just pause there on the mass deaths. James Lovelock has in fact since admitted he was too alarmist, and he says Flannery was as well. And Lovelock now says, and this is a quote, "The problem is we don't know what the climate is doing." But don't bother Flannery with the facts. He says he's furious with the evil people working to make sure that this great slaughter of billions happens. Now, he says the climate crisis has now grown so severe that the actions of the denialists have turned predatory. They are now an immediate threat to our children. My children and those of many prominent polluters and climate denialists will probably live to be part of that grim winnowing, a world that the Alan Joneses and Andrew Bolts of the world have laboured so hard to create. And for a third time, Flannery implies that sceptics like me are like child abusers. He says, "I have come to understand they are threatening my children's well-being as much as anyone who might seek to harm a child." Now, this is very nasty abuse. It's foul. I'm a predator on children. But this is so part of the culture now, isn't it? Forget reason, go for abuse, vilification. Now, like Flannery, I do have children. And if I thought there was the remotest chance of our global warming wiping them out, I would pledge my every waking hour to fighting for cuts to our emissions. But I've checked carefully, and I don't think they are at all threatened by global warming. I'll tell you what they're really threatened by. They're threatened by the culture of unreason that Flannery represents, the wild scaremongering, and they're threatened by the huge cost of listening to false prophets just like him. For instance, Tim Flannery in 2007 claimed that global warming was causing droughts, claimed it was causing the rain to dry up.
Even the rain that falls isn't actually going to fill our dams and our rivers.
But then down came the rain, flooding Brisbane and filling rivers and dams, including Sydney's giant Warragamba Dam. What's more, a real climate scientist, Professor Andy Pittman, head of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes, he now tells us, well, no, global warming isn't causing droughts.
This may not be what you expect to hear, but as far as the climate scientists know, there is no link between climate change and drought.
So Flannery was completely wrong, in fact and in theory, but politicians, they kept listening to him. Especially when he claimed, again more than a decade ago, that in Adelaide, Sydney and Brisbane, water supplies were so low that they needed desalinated water urgently, possibly in as little as 18 months. Well, in all those cities, and in Melbourne as well, Labor governments hurriedly built hugely expensive desalination plants, just as Flannery demanded, billions of dollars worth. But the rains returned, and those desal plants have so far been, for the most part, mothballed. Flannery is so often wrong. The Arctic ice cap could melt completely away by 2010, he said. Wrong. We're getting more cyclones. Wrong again. And when it's wrong, you can really pay. I'll give you another example. Flannery once claimed that well, he still does, our coal-fired power stations, they have to go. Well, have you seen what that's done to your power bills? But he said, oh, well, listen, don't worry. We can use geothermal plants instead, plants which use hot rocks that are way underground. Easy, he said.
There are hot rocks in South Australia that potentially have enough embedded energy in them to run the Australian economy for the best part of a century. The technology to extract that energy and turn it into electricity is relatively straightforward.
Straightforward. Well, the Rudd government foolishly believed Flannery so much that it gave a $90 million grant of our money to a geothermal plant in South Australia, which Flannery had shares in. Except the technology was not straightforward at all. That geothermal plant had been shut down 3 years ago. We still don't have geothermal power. Too hard. So, how should we describe Tim Flannery, who misrepresents experts, misstates the science, makes wild predictions that don't come true, urges us to waste billions of dollars, and scares even children with claims that billions of us will be wiped out? Now, I've got higher standards than Flannery. I'm not going to call him a predator or liken him to some kind of child abuser. I'll keep it simple. He's a crank. A very modern, taxpayer-funded, university-employed crank.